Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third and final session of the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnerships virtual series on the leading edge conservation drainage practices for nutrient loss reduction. My name is Adrienne Marino. On behalf of ISAP and especially on behalf of the conservation, drainage industry, agency, and research partners engaged in developing this meeting series, thank you all for taking the time to join us today. The Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership works to promote a whole systems approach to improving soil health and water quality. The 12 members work collaboratively to provide consistent technical assistance to Illinois farmers and advisors on soil health and conservation drainage practices. You can visit ilsustainableag.org to learn more about our partners, programs, and other opportunities to engage with us. I wanted to take a quick moment for housekeeping before we get started. Today's meeting is being recorded. We will post the recording on ISAP's website as well as provide a link to you in a follow-up email. We're going to be using the chat function in a number of ways during today's meeting. As we're getting started, please feel free to type in your name and organization as well as where you're participating from. This just helps us and others know who else is joining us today. Please also use the chat to report any technical or audio issues, as well as to ask questions to the speaker or panelists. We'll be monitoring the chat for these items, and our speakers will address as many questions as possible during our time together today. All of our participants have been muted upon arrival. Please stay muted to minimize any background noise unless you are speaking. And since we had envisioned holding these meetings in person, you can enhance our shared learning experience by keeping your video on if you're able to do so. So we have a great set of speakers sharing their time with us today. First up is Jill Costell. She's the Senior Environmental Engineer with the Wetlands Initiative. She's going to give us some background on the Ag Conservation Planning Framework. So Jill, take it away. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Patience here as I grab the right thing. All right, thank you again for joining us. And this is the third in our three-part series. In the first part of our three-part series, Nate and I described how the 4 conservation drainage practices reduce the amount of water and or nitrate leaving the field through tile drainage water, and in general terms, what these practices entailed. Doctors Frankenberger and Christensen describe why these practices are important in today's altered hydrology and in achieving our state's nutrient loss reduction strategy goals. Last week in the second session, Dr. Ruth Book, our Illinois State Conservation Engineer, went into a deeper dive on these practices. She provided information on design aspects and requirements. Now, if you missed either 2 of these sessions, you can find the video links on the ISAP website. Today, we're going to take all that information from the first 2 sessions and put it into the context of a watershed plan. A watershed plan that needs essentially 3 elements: for it to be socially acceptable, geographically and scientifically robust, and effective in regards to sediment and nutrient loss reduction. First part is farmer or stakeholder engagement. In this case, we're talking about conservation drainage practices, so understanding what farmer preferences are and what they're likely to implement is key. The second component is water quality monitoring or modeling, which is used to identify the critical source areas with baseline analyses and then the impact that conservation practices can have on the landscape in terms of sediment nutrient loss under different implementation scenarios. And the last component is determining where these practices could potentially be implemented within a watershed. Now, how can we identify which practice can go where in the watershed? Well, one way is through the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework, which is a planning and resource tool where you can identify implementation opportunities at the field scale. So today, Jennifer Jones will be presenting on how ACPF output maps can be used in farmer engagement. Then Jeff Beckler will present an example of how practices cited with an ACPF tool can be used in a water quality model to estimate sediment and nutrient load reduction. And then Keegan Colt will wrap it all up with a talk on a project in Iowa where ACPF has been used to identify potential saturated buffer sites and engage landowners, which is now being leading to implementation. So what is ACPF? It is a customized watershed planning approach. It consists of a framework that's based on a set of conservation practices from infield to edge of stream practices that in combination can improve soil health. It was developed by the USDA Agricultural Research Service in partnership with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The framework is based on a conservation pyramid, which emphasizes soil health and nutrient management as the foundation to nutrient and sediment loss reduction. Healthy, well-managed soils lose less water to runoff and leaching, and then we can add practices that effectively treat losses that occur due to the natural leakiness of ag lands due to tile drainage or surface runoff. These additional practices would control water flow and or treat nutrient losses can be implemented in field, at the edge of field, and in riparian zones. It is a spatially determinate tool supported by 3 databases, which include field boundaries, land use, and soil for HUC 12 watersheds. Now, HUC 12 watersheds are typically 10,000 to 40,000 acres in size, and so this is basically not too small, yet not too big. It's a reasonable area for watershed planning and looking at conservation practices. The ACPF input databases are available for much of the Midwest as shown in this map. Currently over 11,600 watersheds have the most up-to-date high-resolution data sets. And then ACPF utilizes toolboxes within Esri's ArcGIS software to analyze the data sets along with terrain or elevation data to generate output maps that identify possible locations for a variety of conservation practices. Now, I put an asterisk on ArcGIS because ACPF is intended for intermediate to advanced GIS users, as users have to know geoprocessing tools, hydro conditioning, and basic spatial troubleshooting. The ACPF toolboxes can identify locations where specific landscape attributes are favorable for implementing those certain conservation practices. Again, the base is always to avoid and control nutrients at the source with soil health and nutrient management practices. Now, typically we use a default that if a field doesn't get assigned another practice, then cover crops is identified. Now, this doesn't mean cover crops should only be on those fields. We know that we need these foundation practices on as many acres as possible as part of our systems approach to reducing nutrient loss. Now, the ACPF tools identify placement opportunities for practice to address tile drainage and surface runoff. Since we're focusing on tile drainage practices, we can see we have controlled drainage or drainage water management. We can even have restored wetlands down here, but mostly bioreactors, nutrient removal wetlands, as well as saturated buffers. And it also has a module for 2-stage ditches, but we did not look at that one in this case. Just an example of the kind of the inputs that you have a number of databases that you need to link up, but then you have a number of criteria that you have some user control. For example, for the saturated buffers, you can select as a minimum the % organic matter in the soil that is needed in order for that site to be selected as a potential saturated buffer. And this is really where input from your local soil and water and NRCS staff is critical to ensure that these practice criteria that you're putting in the toolbox reflect the local landscape and the practice criteria for NRCS standard practices. The nice thing about the toolbox is that you can modify or add your own toolboxes to reflect the practice standards in your state. For example, the Wetlands Initiative modified the nutrient removal wetland toolbox to better reflect the Illinois 656 standard. Since we're focusing on tile treatment practice, I thought I'd demonstrate how the framework determines where there could be possibly tile in a watershed. In this example watershed, we chose the parameters of greater than 10% of the field has to contain hydric soils. These are former wetland soils, so they tend to hold moisture. Or 90% of the field has to have a slope less than 5%. So in combination, if I can get my mouse back over here, in combination, we then identify by these green fields which ones could possibly have tile drainage and therefore be appropriate for tile drainage practices. So where within the identified green area can we potentially implement, say, drainage water management? This practice requires that the field slope be less than 1%. So then we have to pull in the terrain model and look at areas that are relatively flat. So in this model, the darker the area, the less slope you have. In this scenario, only a few of the fields were identified as having high potential for drainage water management, and that means that 80 to 100% of the field was less than 1% slope. And of course, this is just identifying those areas. We would need to go do some aerial truthing, some ground truthing, incorporating local knowledge. The farmer has the best knowledge to ensure that there's a presence of tile drainage and the field conditions are appropriate. This is just a map showing where ACPF is being used in watershed planning. In Illinois, NRCS, the Wetlands Initiative, and other entities are using ACPF in watersheds that are not necessarily identified on this map. So it is a tool that is widely used. It's been around since 2013. The output maps generated through ACPF can show a suite of practices within a context of a watershed. This helps landowners see potential practice opportunities on their field, but also puts their property into a upstream and downstream context so they can see what, they're not the only ones in the watershed. There's other practices and other opportunities out there. And fields can be assigned more than one practice. So that's where conservation planning and field assessments, inventory, and evaluations are needed to really determine what is the most appropriate practices. And this is just an example in 5 Mile Creek in the Vermilion River headwaters area that a site was identified with the model. We worked with our local partners and the landowner, and then a constructed wetland was implemented. So in summary, what does it do? ACPF provides an inventory of opportunities for conservation practice placement. It is meant to engage and inform landowners and stakeholders and planners in really a collaborative planning effort, and it promotes discussions on a water scale level on conservation activities. So the output maps are meant to serve as a conversation starter. What doesn't it do? It does not make recommendations. It is not a plan. It is a planning resource tool. It does not prioritize practices. It only highlights high priority practices for the conditions of that landscape. It does not allow for direct estimates of pollution reduction. That's when you have to output the data and export it to another type of watershed model. I should add that there are other tools coming out, including a tool that puts in cost estimates and finances. So then you can work on a watershed level on different scenarios, such as how much would that cost if we did scenario A versus scenario B. So all helping with resource planning. So at this point, I'm gonna stop my summary and see if there's any questions.
Well, thanks, Jill. At your very last comment, you really resolved our one question from Ben Grammage, just asking about that cost scenario. So right now it does not, but it's coming.
Well, there is a paper out there from a group in Iowa State University. I don't know if that tool is now available on that website. That's ACPF4watersheds.org. If that tool is now available, but there is a paper that's out, and there was a presentation at the last Soil and Water Conservation Society meeting last week on how that tool is being used.
Great, thanks. And then I'll just ask too, if folks are interested, is the ARS still the best place to go to for resources or support with this tool? Are they still answering questions for people?
Yes, I think they are, but the main website is at ACPF for Watersheds. That is the link. It has the toolkits, it has videos and trainings. I don't think they're still doing in-person trainings still, but there's a ton of videos. There's a ton of resources on that website for anyone who's interested in learning more. But the local NRCS offices I know have, and staff are being trained in different states to do this model as well as other entities. So.
Perfect. And then it looks like Bridget typed into the chat that they also have a message board where peers can kind of troubleshoot as well. Well, that's great. If we have any more questions for Jill, we can keep adding them to the chat, but I think we're ready to move on, Jill. Thank you.
All right, we will ask Jennifer to start sharing her screen because our next speaker is Jennifer Jones. Jennifer is a University of Illinois Extension Watershed Outreach Associate. She works in the Umbra River and the Little Wabash River watersheds. Jennifer?
Sorry about that, I had to find my unmute. All right, good morning, everyone. I am happy to be here this morning. As Jill said, my name is Jennifer Jones, and I am here with University of Illinois Extension. So just to get started, I always like to get everyone on the same page with what the definition of a watershed is, so you can see that there. Another thing that will come up a lot today that Jill's already mentioned is HUCs. So watersheds come in different shapes and sizes, and so the HUC actually means hydrologic unit code. Every watershed has its own unique identifying number. And it's a little counterintuitive, but the bigger the HUC number is, the smaller the watershed is in size. So a HUC 8 watershed is actually bigger than a HUC 10, and a HUC 10 is bigger than a HUC 12. And so multiple HUC 12 watersheds make up a HUC 10, and then multiple HUC 10s make up a HUC 8. So just like to get that out there because it can be a little bit confusing. So most of you are probably already aware of the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy, and that 11 other states in the Mississippi River Basin were also required to release nutrient reduction strategies. Priority watersheds were designated in Illinois as part of our strategy to determine where the greatest nutrient loads were coming from. And so I work in 2 phosphorus priority watersheds in East Central and Southeastern Illinois, which are the Umbra River and Little Wabash River watersheds here in orange. My primary focus is on farmers and helping them implement conservation practices that will help us reach those goals that are outlined in our Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy, which you can see there in the green box. Part of my work also includes assisting communities and stakeholders to develop watershed-based plans. So a watershed plan, Jill already kind of talked about this, but it's a collaborative, stakeholder-supported approach to protecting water resources, and it's often completed on a smaller watershed scale, such as the HUC 12 or HUC 10, though occasionally some are completed on a HUC 8 scale. So watershed plans look at the overall condition of the watershed to see what pollutants are impairing water bodies there. And so this could include things like nitrates, total phosphorus, sediment, fecal chloroform, and several others. And so these pollutants that are present in the watershed are often determined through TMDLs, or total maximum daily loads, that are done through EPA and other water quality monitoring efforts. The plan addresses the water quality issues by providing recommendations of best management practices that can reduce or eliminate those pollutants, and it often occurs over a span of years and through a variety of different practices, from point sources to urban stormwater and ag non-point sources pollution. So it just depends on the particular watershed you're looking at and its land use and what the local stakeholders are willing to do. And so once a watershed plan is approved through EPA, it can be used to apply for cost share money to support implementation of those best management practices in the watershed to help reach the goals that were outlined in the plan. So in one of the watersheds where I focus my work, the Umbra, we are currently working on updating the watershed plan that was completed in 2011. And so plans typically have a lifespan of about 10 years or so, and the Umbras will be expiring next year. So this has been a really neat effort for us because local stakeholders came together and raised a little over $75,000 in match funds so that we were able to apply for a Section 319 grant through Illinois EPA to help support our efforts to update the watershed plan. So we're currently waiting to hear if we receive those grant funds, but if we do, we're hoping to move forward with updating the plan immediately. Actually, we'll be working with Jeff Buckler from Northwater Consulting, who you'll be hearing from after I'm done talking. And so I worked with the Soil and Water Conservation Districts and the county farm bureaus and some Illinois Farm Bureau staff and Jeff in the watershed. This past January, we conducted watershed meetings all throughout the Umbra. We were supported by a grant from the Illinois Farm Bureau's Nutrient Stewardship Grant Program. And so during those meetings, we engaged about 190 farmers and landowners in discussions about their water quality concerns in the Umbra and what tools they wanted to be successful to address those concerns. And then also if they had locations in mind for conservation practices that they might want to implement on their own land. And so all that information that we gather during those meetings will be incorporated into the watershed plan as stakeholder feedback. And so like Jill said, it's really crucial to hear from people who live and work in the watershed to know what concerns they'd like to see addressed in the watershed, because it ensures that they feel ownership in the process and that they will actually engage in reaching those goals that were outlined in the plan. Okay, so now we're going to dive into some ACPF results and how we can use those tools to work with farmers and to get more conservation on the ground. So first, I want to quickly give you some context of the area we're talking about for those of you who may not be familiar with Illinois. So the Umbra is a Huckgate watershed. It's about 1.5 million acres in size. And so now we're going to zoom in, and you can see on the picture on the left, there's a smaller orange and then darker orange watershed outlined here. So the where we zoomed into is Coles County in Illinois, and the light orange line is the Kickapoo Creek Huckton subwatershed, and so it's about 65,000 acres in size. And then the darker orange is the Riley Creek Huck 12, which is about 26,000 acres in size, and that's what we'll be focusing on today and what the ACPF results were run on. Okay, so first I want to thank the Wetlands Initiative for running the toolbox on Riley Creek and providing these maps. I'm going to show you some of the outputs that can be produced through ACPF, but due to time limitations, I'm just going to show you a few so you can get an idea of what the results from ACPF can look like and how these maps can be used to help in conservation planning efforts. I also want to note that these maps have not yet been utilized in conservation planning, but we are hoping to incorporate them in our watershed planning efforts in the Umbra. Okay, so this first map is elevation of the watershed, which you can see part of the city of Mattoon is here on the southwestern corner in this whitish gray color. The red color indicates that it's a lower elevation than the green. So you can see this is Riley Creek here, and the elevation is a bit higher around the creek area. Okay, so this next map is showing the runoff risk in Riley Creek, where the red-orange color indicates a very high runoff risk. And so you can see how this relates to the elevation map we just looked at, because the higher runoff risk areas are typically in that area with higher elevation that was around the creek. All right, and this map is modeling the tile drainage that might be in Riley Creek. So it takes into account the soils information and the slope of the field to predict where tile drainage is likely located, like Jill mentioned earlier too. And this can be generally verified by looking at aerial imagery or talking with the local conservation staff. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of tile drainage in Riley Creek, so lots of potential for conservation drainage practices to be introduced. All right, so now we're going to move on and look at some of those potential opportunities to implement conservation practices that came from the ACPF modeling. So the elevation, runoff risk, and tile drainage maps that we just looked at are part of the equation when determining these possible locations. So I'm mostly going to focus on practices that we've already covered in the previous two webinars in this series just due to time, but Jill showed all the capabilities of ACPF earlier. All right, so this map is showing possible fields that could support drainage water management structures. And you can see from the legend that the darker blue color indicates that greater than 60% of the field is being treated by this practice. Okay, and so this next map is indicating possible locations for constructed wetlands and bioreactors. The wetlands are the purple dots and the bioreactors are the green dots. Okay, and now we're looking at a map that shows potential opportunities for grass waterways, which are the green lines, wasp cobs, which are the purple lines, and contour buffer strips or prairie filter strips, which are the orange lines. And so I should also note the maps can be presented in many different ways. We have 3 practices layered here together on this single map, but you could choose to just show one at a time, or you could layer even more of the practices together. And so it looks like there are a lot of potential spots for grass waterways, but some of these spots might already have one in place. So like Jill said, the maps are a great starting point, but ground truthing is really important to verify that the practice will actually work in the proposed location. Okay, and the last map we'll look at is the suggested locations for saturated buffers. So the yellow lines are suitable locations for a saturated buffer, and the orange lines indicate the spot would be suitable for a saturated buffer with a carbon enhancement, like a wood chip bioreactor wall, or if a trench was added as well. Okay, so now that you've seen some of what the ACPF results look like, let's talk about how what farmers think about ACPF and how conservation planners can actually use these maps to increase adoption of practices. So I'm going to be basing most of this off of a paper that was published in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation earlier this year, and I put the citation at the bottom of the slide. So the researchers from this paper conducted interviews with farmers in 4 watersheds. 3 of those were in Iowa and 1 in Minnesota, where conservation planners had used ACPF results to work with farmers on implementing conservation practices. They wanted to know how farmers perceive targeted conservation efforts like ACPF, and if their perceptions actually translated to support toward targeted placement and motivation to adopt practices on the farmer's own land. So here are some of the benefits the farmers saw from working with conservation planners who utilized ACPF. First, it made sense to the farmers to implement a practice that would help water quality the most at the least cost, or the biggest bang for the buck. So ACPF can give an initial suggestion of what practice would be best suited for a particular location. And farmers typically know the land they farm better than anybody else, right? So when a conservation planner can point out areas of concern on a map and they verify what the farmer sees when they are out doing their own farm operations, it can help validate the whole conservation planning process and increase the farmer's comfort level with working with the planner. And seeing maps of a HUC 12 watershed can help farmers think on a watershed scale if they aren't already, so they can see how water moves across the landscape around them and onto their own farm and eventually downstream, so it encourages bigger picture watershed thinking. Visual maps allow for more meaningful conversation because they can help communicate why a certain practice was suggested for a particular location and why it's beneficial there. Additionally, farmers can learn more about new practices that they may not have known about, particularly like conservation drainage. They may not have heard of a woodchip bioreactor or saturated buffer, and this presents an opportunity to learn more about that. Okay, and so during the interviews, the farmers were asked to provide recommendations for conservation planners trying to use these tools like ACPF. And so the farmers emphasized the importance of feeling like they chose to adopt the practice rather than being told that they had to do it. And so conservation practice recommendations from ACPF are just that, they're recommendations. The farmer can give input on how they would like to see the practice designed if they chose to adopt it, and it's completely voluntary. Using local faces or someone who has built a relationship with the farmer helps during the planning process when possible. So a person who knows the farmer and the land may be able to better tailor the options to that specific farmer. All right, and this next point ties into the first: be suggestive, not prescriptive. So these recommendations are flexible. However, don't let flexibility come across as uncertainty and cause the science to come into question. And initially, sharing the ACPF results to farmers in a group helped them feel comfortable, but they indicated that meeting with a farmer one-on-one would probably be necessary to motivate them to actually take action and adopt the practice. And finally, it's of course important to verify the map's findings with boots on the ground. So like we said, these maps are a great starting point, but next steps should include the conservation planner and farmer walking the field together to verify the practice would work in the suggested area. Okay, so moving forward with ACPF in the Riley Creek, we're hoping to incorporate these results into our watershed planning efforts. And of course, we'll be working with local stakeholders, keeping those farmers engaged and the landowners, the Soil and Water Conservation District, and RCS and Farm Bureau. The hope is that we can find at least one interested farmer who's wanting to try a new practice. So hopefully we can get one of those conservation drainage practices on the ground. And then my hope would be that we could have a field day off of that and get other farmers to be more interested in these types of practices too. With that, thank you.
Okay, I think that's me. I'm up. Hello everyone. I'm gonna try to share my screen here. In the meantime, my name is Jeff Beckler, co-owner of North Water Consulting. We're a small water consulting company based in Springfield, Illinois, and we're involved in lots of different watershed planning projects throughout the state, one that Jennifer mentioned, the Embera River. And I am going to show kind of how we close out the loop on all of this, right? And what load reductions we might be able to achieve from placement of best management practices. So I'm gonna share my screen here and go through a series of slides that I put together, not as fancy as everybody else's, but I think kind of give you the idea of what can be done after the practices are identified and you're moving on to trying to get the biggest bang for the buck, right? So biggest bang for the buck, you want the locations that are going to generate the highest load reductions.
And Jeff, can you share your presentation slide so we can, there you go, now we can see it.
Yep, there it is. So there it is. Okay, so this is what you're seeing here is a spatially explicit loading model that we developed way back in the day for the original Embera River Plan. It has seen a lot of changes since then, but luckily still was able to find it on my network and run some examples through this model just to give you an idea of what it can do, and then also how you can tie reductions to BMP locations. So screenshot obviously of Riley Creek showing the loading model. It's symbolized based on per acre nitrogen load, anywhere from less than 1 all the way up to about 63 pounds per acre. Then overlaid on the model, and again, this is all in GIS, is map-based format, and Jennifer mentioned, you know, visualizing things. This is obviously a good way to visualize where maybe some of the hot spots are. So I've overlaid information from Jill in terms of saturated buffer locations, that the black lines represented on the map there. If you zoom into an area, so I'm taking a certain location here that has catchments or drainage areas associated with a certain string of saturated buffers. You can see the highlighted blue or the catchment areas or drainage basins draining to those saturated buffers. So first I would select those and then essentially cut them out of the model. And so what I'm showing you here is a process in GIS for which I select and then intersect or remove or clip out those drainage areas from the actual model itself. And here's the result. So that result shows now just the per acre loading of the clipped drainage areas to those saturated buffers. And now, as you can see, the symbolizing on the left shows, you know, not quite the range in per acre loading, but this particular area ranges from less than 1 to about 9 pounds per acre. So next slide. So then from there, once they're cut out, I run it through this fancy thing called a model, which is really just a series of steps in ArcMap to calculate fields in the model or recalculate fields in the model. Once that's run, I've essentially corrected for cutting those parts or those custom pieces out of the model. And now it's time to go through and calculate load reductions. You can see on the left, I've got a column I created called N_RED or nitrogen reduction. And I've taken the total load of nitrogen for those areas and I've multiplied it by 0.55, which is literature-based removal efficiency for saturated buffers to come up with the total reductions associated. And here's a resulting map symbolized based on the reductions achieved. And you can see on the left-hand side there that the intersected saturated buffer, that area can achieve anywhere but between less than 1 and all the way up to 1,027 pounds of nitrogen reduction per year. And if we add it all up for each one of those, totals come to roughly 14,091 pounds per year of nitrogen reduced if those saturated buffers are ideally implemented in that particular subbasin. And again, like I said, I used a 55% removal efficiency. So that's about it. This is another slide showing cover crops. I'm not going to get into too much detail so we have more time for questions, but just glad to be here to show you how to kind of close out the loop and take some recommended project locations, calculate load reductions, and then from there, you know, the idea would be to prioritize them based on which ones maximize those reductions for your particular watershed. So that's all I had.
I'll give folks time to drop questions into the chat box if they have them, but I guess I do have a question then. It seems like most ACPF tools are run for a HUC 12, but with so much land in Illinois to cover and so many water quality goals, have any of you that have spoken or haven't spoken yet seen how you can take the learnings from a pretty intensive process of going through the ACPF tool and apply it to a broader area?
I can't say I have, because I think it's the model is really tailored to that HUC 12, so you have flexibility in terms of making it very specific to that watershed. And you know, the example in some of our larger watersheds, we have a lot of change from north to south or east to west, so that's why the HUC 12 is kind of like that perfect kind of little thing. And also it takes a lot of power to generate the data with the databases and the high resolution data. So I don't think you can really take one and scale it up per se. But I think you could make some estimates on nutrient load reduction, maybe, based on the number of practices that you have. Say, I had so many saturated buffers, you know, length of saturated buffer, I had so many constructed wetlands treating this area, drainage area, and you could probably make a broader number. But I think you really just want to keep it to that HUC 12 level just to really finesse it and really get the results that you can from that. But I also think it's easier to do scenarios that way. And I was going to ask Jeff that, and actually Ben has also a question too. How hard would you think, Jeff, I know we kind of introduced you to this in putting ACPF on you, to do different types of scenarios. So we say take certain bioreactors out, put in certain constructed wetlands, and do different combinations to try to achieve a certain nutrient reduction. Easy, hard? You're muted, by the way.
Yeah, the unmute thing. Okay, yeah. So really, the only limitation with our particular model, anyways, is the ability to have the drainage areas, right? So, I mean, it's very difficult to model just a saturated buffer if we just have a location of the saturated buffer. So, like you saw there, we had to actually run it through using drainage areas. So, really, it's quite easy to do if those are available, right? And infield management is quite easy because it's easy to get field boundaries, right? Essentially, that's the drainage area associated with that infield practice, say cover crops, for example. But when it comes to structural practices, having some ability to have delineated sub-watersheds or watersheds draining to those practices is needed to accurately generate load reductions.
So that's something that the GIS user for ACPF will probably have to sit there. It's not an automatic output from ACPF. So that's another tool that you can add into ACPF. Ben had a question. Any idea what share of the total N lost from baseline practices till today from land in that clipped area represents? So that 15,000 pounds lost.
Calculating. So the total load for that area is 25,620 pounds. So what was my reduction? I don't know, so 14,000, right? About 14,000. Should be about 52% if I use that removal efficiency. So 14,000 divided by 2,520 equals, oh yeah, about 55% of the load.
That's kind of funny because that's
Yes.
the efficiency you use. So,
Yeah.
And the nice thing about, obviously, as people know, we can work with a range of efficiencies just to help us with prediction, and then add in as well as the infield practices, which we know are going to be critical. Bridget asked, did we do any other ground truthing besides on an individual farmer's field? Well, in this case, we just ran the ACPF. I did some Well, first we asked Jennifer which watershed in their umbrella would be most likely to have a lot of tile drainage, and Riley Creek she knew. And I can say by the aerial satellite imagery, it has a lot of tile drainage because you can pick it up on certain satellite years. And then from that, we just did essentially an aerial ground truthing, which eliminates a lot of the locations. You know, we don't put things on top of parking lots usually. And then, but the next stage, I should emphasize, it should be an iterative process, right? We give the maps back to Jennifer. She goes back and works with her farmers, her conservation planners, her NRCS and soil water staff, just to make sure if this makes sense. Do the results make sense? And then come back, maybe change the maps a little bit, and then maybe export it into a watershed model, just to then kind of see what the load reductions would be in that scenario. So there's a couple steps in between, I would say, before we even get to the watershed model. So we're gonna, if you have any additional questions, we can take it in the general Q&A, but I want to introduce Keegan Colt, who's gonna be our last presenter today. And Keegan is the Executive Director of the Agricultural Drainage Management Coalition, which is an industry-led group that works to accelerate the adoption and implementation of conservation drainage practices. All right, Keegan.
All right, thanks, Jill. Can everybody hear me and see me before I get going again? All right, so those that attended the SWCS conference a couple weeks ago might recognize this presentation as pretty similar, but today I'm going to be talking about a project we're doing as a coalition to help accelerate the adoption of these edge of field practices that we've been talking about in this series of webinars the last 3 weeks. And to do that, we actually use the ACPF tool, so it fed in really well with this third meeting that we're having here today. Just a little bit of background on ADMC. We are an industry-led organization. This is my board representation here, 13 board members representing quite a bit of the drainage industry. So you see a lot of the tile manufacturers in here, the engineers that are doing the design, to the contractors that are actually putting these practices on the ground. ADMC's main task is to find practices that work with our drainage system so we can keep that agronomic output that we want to see, but at the same time improve our environmental performance of these systems. So we're really looking to accelerate the adoption of a lot of these practices. How are we doing? Well, I would say it's been pretty slow to date. I see Dr. Ruth Book's on the chat again today, and she presented last week. But these are some slides that she prepared for a meeting earlier this year at the Conservation Drainage Network, just outlining how many of these practices have gone through EQIP or through NRCS cost share over the past 5 years. And this is for bioreactors and saturated buffers. So you can see here over the past 5 years, we've only seen about 50 of these practices utilize the NRCS programs. This doesn't mean only 50 of these have gone in nationwide. There's other cost share opportunities, and we'll actually talk about those at the end of the meeting here today that these can go through. But we really set kind of the gold standard with these NRCS conservation practice standards. A lot of effort goes in to putting data into these standards so we know that they're sound and the practices will work. We're kind of beholden to these standards a lot of times. We design to meet these specifications even if we don't use NRCS funds to do so, because we want to have kind of that stamp of approval that we're doing it up to NRCS par. But at the same time, you know, we're seeing that these adoption of these practices are a little bit slower, and we know some of the barriers to these adoptions, so we're trying to address it. So I kind of made this joke last time at SWCS, but these practices, they are engineered practices. So engineers, we tend to be kind of a literal group, and so SWCS put out this pamphlet about stopping hypoxia 1 BMP at a time. It was supposed to be kind of a motivator, I think, but maybe us engineers took this a little too seriously, and we're literally installing one of these edge of field practices at a time. So what can we do to accelerate this so we can actually meet some of our goals? I believe in Illinois, you guys have a 15% reduction goal milestone in your nutrient reduction strategy standard by 2025. And so in order to meet that, we really need to scale up these efforts. So one of the things that we're looking at doing at ADMC was, well, we have quite a bit of experience of putting these things in 1 or 2 at a time, and even at these watershed efforts, but how do we really scale this up? So actually, I'm based in Ankeny, Iowa, which is in Polk County. And there was some local project leadership that said, hey, we have some funding available. We're just not getting these practices out as fast as we can. What can we do? Actually, they had some change of staff at the local SWCD. And so they had a new staff person come in, and they were worried that these were just going to fall through the wayside. So we reached out, and we actually have a contract with the Polk SWCD to help walk through this process of getting these things out there. We kind of looked at the amount of funding that we had in place, and we set a goal of 25 saturated buffers in a year, which maybe that number doesn't sound huge, but when we think about it, in Iowa, we see about 50 to 60 of saturated buffers and bioreactors put out over the last 10 years. So we'd be seeing about half of that going in just 1 year. So obviously that'd be a huge increase. And 25 was picked because we didn't want to set the bar too high and make it look like a failure of a project. Because if we hit, we had a 50 goal and we put 40 in, that's actually a pretty good year, but it might not look as a win. Also, we wanted to make sure we had enough funding in place to get it done. So how we set up our framework to actually accomplish this was we wanted to make sure we were in watersheds that had some planning done already. And actually, we looked at some watersheds in Polk County that had ACPF ran. The Iowa Soybean Association actually ran this model for about 6 of their Huck 12s in Polk County. And so we identified 4 of those watersheds that had high occurrence of these saturated buffers. Obviously, we didn't want to pick off a project to put 25 saturated buffers in place only to find out there's not that many suitable sites in the watershed after we got going. So using ACPF really helped us do that. We do realize that these practices are mainly beneficial downstream, more so than to the farmer. And so we wanted to incentivize landowner participation by matching funding sources to provide 100% cost share on the practice. And actually, Polk County was so interested in seeing this go in, they were able to provide a small incentive payment through a temporary construction easement from when we actually do the installation work. And the goal with that was just to really get farmers and landowners in the door and excited about the project. We actually think we're going to save money on the back end of this by providing this small incentive payment, because it's going to save us a lot of time on going out and trying to recruit people to participate. It saves quite a bit of time on the design side of things because we're designing multiple sites at once instead of just one at a time. And same with the installation. The next thing that we made an intentional effort was, if we had a farmer or landowner that was interested in working with us, we're working with them to install multiple sites, not just that one tile outlet on their field for now. I've been to a lot of field days where we're all excited and we're putting a bioreactor saturated buffer in the ground, and then usually a farmer will walk up to the stream and look down and say, what about those 4 outlets right there that are draining just as much water into the stream right now? What are we doing about that? And so hopefully with this project, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. I guess we're treating multiple sites, but we're also, getting our numbers up in 1 year, making it a lot more efficient process. The next, we brought together a leadership team to really make this easy for the landowners, to streamline the process for them. I'm glad Jennifer mentioned, kind of the bigger group setting to introduce these practices, but it really takes that one-on-one follow-up and multiple follow-ups. There's not too many. You'll have a handful of farmers that are interested and keep on coming in the door, seeing how this practice and project's going on. But it really takes the project team to keep on reaching out to that farmer and landowner to keep kind of pushing them along through the process and make sure that they're not forgotten about and that they're still interested. And then finally, we're looking to bundle these sites. I represent a lot of drainage contractors in the coalition as well. And some of the feedback that we get with these practices, especially the saturated buffer, is it's just too small to really fit into their business model right now. If they're going out, mobilizing, taking time off, or maybe doing some larger projects, to put in a project that only costs about $3,500. They really can't make that work into their business model with their overhead costs. They got to be making more money at a time to keep their business going into the next season. And so we took that into consideration, and instead of allowing an individual landowner to work with a contractor, we're actually bundling multiple landowners into a bid package. So we're going to have them install 15 to 20 sites at a time in each of these bid packages, hopefully to make it more of an attractive practice to the contractor. So these are just the outputs from those ACPF runs. You can see we had quite a few hits for both saturated buffers and bioreactors. This made us feel good about the sites and the watersheds that we picked. We narrowed it down to the 4 HUC 12s just so we're working in a narrower geographic region. Once again, we wanted to kind of minimize those mobilization costs for a contractor. We're thinking this will make it more cost effective if they don't have to pick up and move 3 miles down the road to put the next site in if they're just going from field to field in consecutive order. We think we're going to make a bigger impact with this project. This is what those outputs look like. You've seen a couple of these earlier today already. The yellow lines represent the saturated buffers. The red dots are bioreactors. You can kind of see the wetland drainage areas and the wetland buffers in there in purple and green as well. But we sat down and we're really focused on the saturated buffers in this project. The project lead sat down, looked at this output. We actually eliminated some of the sites from these ACPF outputs. Polk County has a lot of urban development, urban sprawl going on, and these watersheds were right on the edges of those. So we wanted to make sure we weren't in a projected development zone within the next 10 years because we don't want to pay for a practice and then have it just be torn out of the ground to put in some townhouses. We also threw out sites where it just looked like the drainage area was too small and really not worth the time and effort to try to put one in. Or if the buffer was all trees right there, we might have not considered those sites. The next thing that we did after we kind of narrowed down our sites is we reached out with a mailing to everybody that had hits in these ACPF tools. And in this mailing, we included just a simple flyer describing the project itself, a letter to the landowner directly, and also some site maps for them. We wanted to lay out, how easy we're trying to make this for the farmers and the landowners about the cost share and the incentive payment as well, and how we were going to walk them through all the sign up process so they wouldn't have to worry about it. We tried to instill a little pride, talking about how we're going to establish them as a leader in conservation drainage practice and really be one of the first areas to take the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy seriously and kind of to the next level. We also included these maps showing the fields, and I think Jennifer also mentioned that helps a lot to have that physical map saying we're talking right here about this practice, especially with some of these landowners that were bigger and have multiple fields. It's really hard to call them up and say, hey, you have a field with saturated buffer, which one? And they're confused, which one is it? I will also mention that when we were going through and screening out the sites, we took note to which landowners had multiple hits and many fields in, so we knew that we had to do kind of be extra careful with them when we spoke to them and be really prepared to talk to them to get them in the door, because we realized if we get the bigger landowners in the door, that really would help our case to get multiple sites in the ground faster. And we're also very intentional of when we did this mailing. We wanted to make sure that the project team would be able to follow up within a few days of the farmer and landowner receiving the letter, just so it didn't sit on a shelf and then sit there for a month or two, and then somebody call them like, oh, I kind of remember that letter, or they didn't remember that letter. It was really fresh in their head. We also made sure not only could we call them within a few days, but we could have a survey team go out to the site within a few weeks to provide them some follow-up. And I think that really, really helped our case. So the status of this, we've had actually really, really good response, better than we were expecting actually. We were given access to over 105 tile outlets to survey. And each one of those, if farmers and landowners were pretty much go ahead if it works, we'll sign up for the practice right now. We were working with over 15 landowners. Initially, we had 87 sites. We are including bioreactors actually because if we found they didn't work for a saturated buffer, but the landowner was still interested, we didn't want to turn them away just because we weren't specifically targeting bioreactors with this initial outreach. So we had about 70 saturated buffer sites, 17 bioreactors. Yesterday we updated that. We're probably down to about 60 saturated buffers, still with 17 bioreactors after we've eliminated a few more sites for various reasons. Right now we're just working on the final designs of these, and then we're also creating the bid package that's going to go out early September to hopefully start getting these things installed at the end of the year. A lot of partners were part of this. The big ones would be Polk County, actually, and the Polk SWCD. We also work very closely with our Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, since they're providing the state cost share portion of this. And then the NRCS office has been very helpful. Actually, they were able to provide the design services for this project. We had constant communication with them if this would be overwhelm the workload for them or not with this many sites, and we kind of were always giving them heads up, a few weeks in advance of what we would need. Even to the NRCS team that does the soil surveys, we had a few sites that we need to do some more in-depth soil reviews to make sure the sites would work for us. Then also working with FSA, now with the CLEAR initiative, saturated buffers and bioreactors can go into CRP ground if it's a CP21 or CP22. And so we were utilizing that program as well. So we're converting some of these contracts for the landowners from a CP21 to that CP21S, which is some workload for the FSA to do. And so we're giving them a heads up well in advance that they might have 30 to 40 of these coming in their door. Can they handle it? And so far it's worked out very well. Next steps, after we get the successful implementation late this fall, hopefully, we're actually going to analyze the ACPF outputs to look for false positives and false negatives. Kind of with the scale of this project, we had a lot of luck. If a farmer had a hit with a saturated buffer site on that ACPF output, we would actually visit as many sites as that farmer would let us, even if the original ACPF run said it wasn't a suitable site. We'd still go out there and see if a saturated buffer would actually work, and we found in quite a few cases it would. And so we're going to evaluate why maybe ACPF missed that, and hopefully improve the model. So we're working with the developers at ARS and are going to be providing them feedback. We're doing a follow-up survey with the landowners to see why they chose not to participate. We've actually marked down quite a few landowners that we think would kind of be not early adopters in this first set of outreach, but maybe they might do after they see a lot of these go in and that they're working for their neighbors, that they might be willing to participate next year if we find some funding for the project again. We're evaluating if that incentive payment that we're providing is going to be a net positive for the overall project cost. Did we save money in the long term by providing that incentive payment from the amount of time that we've saved from going out and doing these surveys? The survey crews are generally doing 10 to 20 tile lines in a day instead of in Iowa, they were doing 5. That would have been a really good day prior to that. So we think we're going to save money in the long terms. There's going to be some follow-up monitoring on the sites once they're installed. Polk SWCD actually has a contract already with the Iowa Soybean Association to monitor. We've had interest for some other groups from Iowa State University to do some monitoring. I think there's a SIG application in to do some novel monitoring. We're going to have some sites that we would call managed saturated buffers because it's a little bit flatter. So we're looking to put an automated control structure in, and they're going to look at how effective these managed saturated buffers can be. It's a combination of controlled drainage at that point and a saturated buffer. And then finally, we're hoping to take the show on the road. So finding out what worked here, how can we apply this in other states, not just Iowa, take it to Illinois, Indiana, and Minnesota, and Ohio, hopefully. A key to success, that local project coordinator, obviously very important, somebody to have the relationships with the farmers already. We found that multiple funding sources are needed. Don't overwhelm the landowners with where these sources are coming from unless they're asking. But we're able to match state funding and federal funding pretty well. And so I think that's a model that can be used going forward. Very intentional project management, setting timelines to follow because there's so many partners involved. If one partner gets behind, it really throws the rest of the project behind. That consistent communication. And then project leadership, it's really helpful to have people that know their way through all these cost share programs with the state and federal side of things to make sure we can kind of dot the I's and cross the T's for everybody and make sure we can get these things in the ground. So with that, I can take any questions.
If anyone has specific questions for Keegan, feel free to put those into the chat box. I do want to address a question that Tom had presented earlier. He was asking a question in terms of ACPF model input and in terms of what data, elevation data is required. For ACPF, the toolbox really does require a high resolution digital elevation model. in order to do the terrain analysis and the hydraulic modeling. So in this case, LiDAR, if it's available, is basically the best thing and the only thing you should be using, because you're doing some really finite and pit filling and hydro conditioning and looking at stream bank heights and stuff like that. So you want to get as high resolution data as possible. I have a question for you, Keegan, since you have applied this methodology from using the maps for outreach. Was there any negative feedback from any of the landowners who felt they were being targeted for a particular package, or it was more informative?
I really don't think so. I think there was some questions about why their site was identified. You know, they didn't know if they were, you know, doing something that they were being targeted for, but they weren't as adversarial about that as you would think. We just explained, no, this was a model that looked at soils and slopes and a few other considerations, and that's why we reached out to you. And yeah, we didn't have anybody, I guess, that really felt like they're being victimized or anything.
I just, you know, it can go either way when you show someone a map with, you know, practices allocated to their site. So that was nice that they saw it as informative, which is the whole point of the tool, is to be informative. And it's still a voluntary effort for the installation and implementation of these practices. Since we have some time here and we didn't have as much time in the first two sessions, for those who were in viewed the first two sessions, if you have any questions from those sessions as well, feel free to ask those there. Most of the participants of those are on here today, so we can have those questions just answered as well. But once again, if you have any questions for our speakers today, please let us put it in the chat box. Otherwise, it's me talking.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Keegan, did you run into any landowner operated dynamics with this effort? Did you contact both?
We did not contact both, actually, and so we haven't ran into those dynamics yet. We did go directly to landowners on this and, you know, told them they need to check with their operator on it. On most of these sites that we were identifying are kind of the set it and forget it saturated buffers, where, you know, the control box will be out there, but you don't really have to do any management on those stop logs. There's a handful of sites that we let the landowner know that, you know, this would probably need to be changed 3 to 4 times a year, kind of based on how the precept's going that year. And so they were talking with their landowners about it. We had some interesting, you know, we worked with a farm management company on this, on a couple of their sites. So that's even kind of a third party, not even the landowner at that point in time. And so that was interesting to work with. And they were very, I guess, excited about the practice and wanting to talk to the farmers. I will say it really helped to, and we, like I mentioned, we made note of kind of who the bigger landowners were in these watersheds. And, you know, I think we set up an initial meeting more so than just a phone call with them. And, you know, we had one farmer landowner sign up. You know, we had access to about 25 of his sites. And so, and he was pretty excited about doing all this. You know, we said we replaced the old outlets with new outlets. So he saw that as a big bonus to him, actually. In another situation, there's a kind of a developer that also has a lot of farm ground that they manage in the area that we're able to crack through and work with. And Polk County, so their AGI is too high to work with a lot of the federal programs, but Polk County actually came up with a payment to do, put the filter strip in place and basically give him a rental rate like he was doing equip on it. And they were excited about that because they hadn't done it before because they could never get that rental rate. But now Polk County kind of provided that funding for them. So now they are putting in a brand new filter strip for the project. And the farmer's not upset. The farmer actually wanted that landowner to put a filter strip in there because he's been seeing that bank get cut back year after year. So it was kind of a win-win.
Excellent. Have you guys made any predictions on your nutrient load reduction from the installation of these 70-some saturated buffers and 17 bioreactors?
Not yet. We probably will. We did take a grab sample when we surveyed to make sure, you know, there was nitrogen coming from the system, or if we're kind of on the fence, is it too small of a drainage area to be really worth treatment? You know, if that small of a drainage area actually had a high nitrate concentration, kind of made it a go in our mind. There's quite a bit of monitoring here. We actually have Drake University has a a nitrate bot, it's called. It's a boat that the landowners were kind of excited about. It's going to go up the stream. It's a remote control boat that has a nitrate sensor on it. And so they can actually see the concentration gradient in the stream. You can kind of see when the tiles come in, where they're at. We're actually treating 17 of these tiles along this 2.5 mile stretch of stream. So that'll be some interesting data to look back on in the next couple of years.
All right, thank you. We have some questions coming in there. Are there other models like ACPF out there? Well, I think, not that I can't think of a specific one, but I know we had, before ACPF came out, we had generated our own kind of wetland identification model. Where would you cite these in an area? But I feel like ACPF is the most comprehensive in terms of citing the practices and the most flexible. I don't know if anyone, Keegan, Jeff, if you know of another similar model that does this type of citing.
Yeah, I do. Looking at aerial imagery and then driving the watershed and getting out into it.
Okay, then maybe the second step after you kind of narrow down the options. So, okay. So yes, I think ACPF, the reason why it's being used everywhere, is the most comprehensive tool. Bridget asks, how long does it take to run ACPF? That, you know, it can take several months to work out all the bugs and a lot of learning curve. I agree. We have a geospatial analyst who, when ACPF was doing the in-person trainings, we sent there, and then there's still issues, right? That's why you have to have someone who's very familiar with ArcGIS and all the ins and outs with importing, you know, data and what the issues are with hydro conditioning and doing modifications. I know for a while we were running a watershed in Vermilion River, and it was taking over a week just to kind of identify the depressional areas, which then is a step to identifying, you know, restored wetlands or potential restored wetland areas or surface intakes. And we couldn't understand why. So there are bugs in the system. They're constantly putting out, you know, on that website, updates to the tools, reporting things, as you mentioned, the chat board. But yeah, it takes some finessing of the model to sometimes to get it to run quickly. But once it's running, it can run all the scenarios, I think, for a reasonable size HEC12, like 12,000 acres, within 2 days. So it does take some computer power and time. What is your opinion comparing the Iowa approach compared to the Minnesota buffer regulation approach, which is more effective in improving water quality? Well, I'm going to hand that one off to Keegan because that sounds like that's your area.
Yeah, you know, we still like to see the voluntary approach being taken, and I don't know how effective the Minnesota, you know, buffer approach is. I'm not sure how wide it's supposed to be. Is it 15 or 20 feet wide of buffer? You know, is that actually doing a whole lot or not? I guess I haven't seen the data on that. You know, we really like to engage these farmers. They do need a little push sometimes, but you know, I think if we can actually show them where the concerns are at, they're willing to participate in these programs. You know, water monitoring has kind of been a big revelation over the past 5 years. A lot of these farmers have been implementing a lot of these BMPs. You know, they might be following the nutrient recommendations from the university. They're kind of, you know, they're in compliance with NRCS already. And so if you go out there and take a sample of water, they're a little surprised that they might have higher nitrate coming from the field. And once you show them that, then they're usually pretty interested in finding solutions that work with them to reduce that amount of nitrogen.
Hey, the next question actually is a good lead-in for our slide that you prepared, Keegan, talking about financial assistance that or cost share that is available for these conservation drainage practices. We're not saying this is all-inclusive by any means, but there are a number of federal and state and private funding sources for Illinois, for those that are interested. The nice thing with the latest NRCS CART system is when you put your application in, it determines, you know, the appropriate pool to draw from. So that is great for our farmers. The question was, how does Polk County finance those payment enhancements? Is it county funds or a special assessment?
I don't believe they had a special assessment. It might be county funds, but they do work with some nonprofits, and so Des Moines, the state capital's there, and so there's some pretty big groups looking to get conservation on the ground. So I think they have some good relationships with those groups that might have provided some funding to the county.
All right, we see there's more questions coming in. If we don't get to them, we will answer them via email. It's a real quick one, then we're going to turn it back to Adrian. Bridget asks, have we utilized SWOT with ACPF to refine those assessments? We haven't. There's a couple other models out there that we're looking at to export the results to kind of tell the whole story of the different scenarios that maybe you can have to achieve a certain HUC-12 nutrient loss reduction goals. Jeff has his own watershed model that he used in this instance to kind of help us show how the two kind of are linked together. So that's kind of the next step. And there's more tools and toolboxes coming out to help integrate ACPF with other watershed and water quality models out there. So I think at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Adrian to kind of wrap us up.
Great, thank you. Keegan, do you want to stop sharing your screen? And I'm gonna, all right, thanks. All right, so thank you all of our speakers today for some great presentations. Thank you for all the questions. Really good discussion. I want to take a quick moment to just recognize all of the steering committee members who have assisted in developing this virtual series and also who helped us adapt it to changing needs. This is maybe our plan C, so I appreciate all of them being involved. I also want to give a quick shout out to Jean Brokish and April Paddock with American Farmland Trust, who've been assisting with the technical and communication details with this series. So if you need to claim CEU credits, you can do that today. We have 1 credit for soil and water management available. You can scan the code here. You can type your name and certification number into the chat box, or you can respond to our follow-up email with your name and certification number. We encourage you to check out ISAP's resources on our website at ilsustainableag.org, particularly if you have ideas about how we can work together to scale up implementation of conservation drainage practices. We would love to hear from you. We'll also be sending out a brief survey after this meeting. Look for it either tomorrow or Monday, included with the recording, and we invite you to offer your feedback and suggestions for how we can improve and what additional topics you might be interested in the future. And finally, we also invite you to join us for another ISAP webinar on September 3rd. This one's going to focus on managing phosphorus in conservation cropping systems, and it is being organized by our partners at American Farmland Trust, and it's being offered through the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership. There is more information, including the list of speakers and registration information available at the URL on your screen. So thank you very much for your time today, for participating, for joining us over the past 3 weeks. I've learned a lot. I hope you have too, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.